Well, hello again there, everybody. Brandon here. So I am getting ready to start another painting, and the inspiration for this one actually started out there. If you have a look at what's going on out here today, it just looks cold, and that's because it is cold. In fact, I think the weather said that we were about 15 degrees colder than Anchorage, Alaska out here. So what I have decided is I am going to wander myself back here into my painting area, and I am going to paint a snow scene based off some photos that I actually got from a fishing outing. Must have been last winter, actually, a fishing outing here. I got several photos that I collected that are on a river that we were doing some fishing at with some snow. So what I'm going to do is piece about 2 or 3 of these together to create a scene that I'm going to paint based off of my inspiration of how cold it was outside. I decided to do a little bit of a snow scene here, so we're going to get started on that painting now. You know, one of the main reasons why I decided to start painting a little over 2 years ago was I always kind of felt like it would be neat to paint some of the places that I go and fish. And, you know, I'd always gotten some inspiration from the places that I would fish in terms of just the scenic beauty of them, particularly the mountain streams that I would go and visit to trout fish. I always took a lot of photos of them. I like to look back on pictures of places that I'd been, and I was always inspired by those areas. So I looked at the thought process of, hey, maybe if I could pull off painting these things, that would be kind of a cool thing to do. So being so cold out on this particular day, my mind went back to a day on the Davidson River, North Carolina here. We had a lot of snow, and so I was sifting through some of these images here, and I got 2 here in particular. This particular shot here, I really liked the water in this one, the way the sun and the light came through. Didn't particularly love the background though, so this image here, I like the background a little better. So I decided to combine these two to paint a snow scene here on the Davidson River. So it's just a matter of putting some stuff on the canvas here and seeing what we get. Now, I felt like oil paints were probably going to be important on this one, so I'm going to dig out some oil paints to try to make the snow look the way I want. But with like any of my paintings that I do, I'm still going to layer a base layer down with acrylic paints first. So I got my basic sketch in place here, a pencil sketch of the areas that I wanted, and started to lay in my acrylic base layer. And I really wanted to communicate some of that sun that was coming through the distant trees back there, kind of a late evening thing. So you don't really see much sunlight hitting really anything in this middle area of the painting, but you do see some sunlight kind of hitting those trees off in the distance there. So I've got a little bit of a lighter color there with some yellows involved to try to communicate that sun that was going to be coming through in some of those distant trees back there. And also we have a few places that the sun will be coming through and hitting the water here ultimately. So the background for me here was really just a matter of laying in some tree texture back there to make it look like a wintertime scene. Not a lot of leaves on those larger trees here. The rhododendrons obviously keep their green leaves on them all year, so putting in these rhododendrons along the shoreline, had to put in some green leaf texture there. And then trying to communicate the snow. You know, I've done a couple of snow paintings at this point. I'd say I've done maybe 4 or 5 of them. And trying to get the snow to look right is always a little bit of a challenge, because snow in and of itself, of course, is white. But when you're trying to paint snow, you don't just go out there and put white on the canvas and expect it to look right. So I wanted to give the idea that most of that snow in the distance was laying in the shade, so I didn't want to put a lot of bright saturated white color on it. And I wanted to save some of that for some of these areas that the sun would be hitting coming in from the left side, closer to the foreground anyway. In the same way with some of this snow along these rhododendron leaves and along this shoreline to the right, it's covered in rocks. Just basically putting in a muted gray kind of base layer of acrylic paint here to communicate that snow that's laying in the shade. Trying to drop in a little bit of tree, limb, and branch indications here and there, just to give the idea that there are some of that going on here coming out of these rhododendrons. And then using some smaller brushes here, I've been working mostly with liner brushes at this point. Liner brushes and spotter brushes, laying in some of this distant tree line. And now working with a small angle brush here to try to touch up some of the shoreline that I'm dealing with here. And some of this process here is just a matter of putting color on the canvas and seeing if it works the way I want it to work, and then going back and adjusting it if it doesn't come out the way I wanted it to. And you know, this snow painting for me has been definitely trial and error of putting some color down and seeing if it is looking the way that I want it to look, and then going back and adjusting it with darker tones or lighter tones, trying to figure out how to create those shadows in those places in the snow here on the left. So you've got rocks that are underneath this snow that create a little bit of a tricky deal of shade and highlight on top of the highest points of these rocks, but then a lot of darker snow that's tucked in between them. And so it's just a process of me trying to figure that out, and you'll see me go back and forth here with a couple of different brushes here. I've used a blender brush there, and here I decided that I wanted to extend that shoreline out a little bit, create a little bit different perspective here on my river. So I narrowed down this top section a little bit and tighten it up some to make it look a little bit flatter on the land here, and then I brought that point out a little bit to try to create a little bit of perspective of the water coming in. And then I just continue to work back and forth here with shades of color here. Now I'm starting to bring in a little bit of a blue into this shadow up front here, because I figured it's in the foreground. A little more of the visibility of the color would come through in terms of the shadows. So I brought in a little bit of the blue there into the shadow areas. And then I just kind of fade that out as I moved away from the viewer here, back into mostly just grays, trying to just communicate that distance. And it took a lot of adjusting here on this snow, really kind of fading in the highlights. Then I decided on this right side here that I wanted a little bit larger rock kind of coming off of the picture here, that's got some snow on the top of it. So I decided to drop that in. I've moved over to the oil paints now, so I'm starting to highlight things out in the oil paints here, and I'm putting highlight touches on the tops of this area that might be catching a little bit more of the light. And still just working with these shapes that I'm trying to create here on the shoreline with the rocks. And you know, I would just back up and look at it and say, okay, that's starting to look better. Now I've moved into some reflections in the water, and really I wanted to start these reflections with just some indications that it's reflecting that snow along the shoreline. And then I've moved into the rocks here that are going to be visible, because this particular area of the river was shallow enough that you could see the rocks on the bottom, and also you had sunlight coming through here that was making these more visible. And I inspected those rocks pretty carefully there. There's a lot of colors that are being transmitted through there. There's lots of reds and oranges and browns and yellows, and a wide variety of color being communicated through those rocks. So I went back and forth here with a lot of different mixes of yellow ochre and medium red, creating a lot of red and orange values and some brown and tan in there, and really mixed a lot of that in just small little pieces on each rock, and then tried to put the shadows beneath the rocks that would just give you the idea that, hey, you can definitely see rocks that are along the bottom of this river here. And this is another process of just back and forth, and then as you move into the deeper areas of the river, the rocks are not nearly as visible, but you can kind of see some of the color coming through. So I'm bringing in some of that yellow and orange tones along the bottom, a little further away from you and a little out into the deeper areas of the river. And then now bringing in more of the shadows that are going to be thrown by either the bank or some trees along the bank there, and then darkening up the deeper areas of the river. Mostly just some raw umber and a touch of black in there to bring that darker area in. Once I got pretty happy with the way that the base of the water looked here, I start working back on the reflections of the snow and maybe some from the sky itself. And really I just brought in some real thin glaze reflections first here that you can see along mostly this right side that's reflecting a lot of that shoreline snow. And then I just basically start to bring in a little brighter whites to highlight some areas where the reflections are being caught by some of the current that this river is bringing through. And you know, it's just a matter of dropping in more color, stepping back from the painting, looking at it, trying to see if it looks right, adjusting it if need be, until you're happy with the finished product here. So this was a process for me that was a little bit different and unique. I hadn't painted quite this type of scene before. The other snow scenes I'd painted had not been a large river like this. But I'm pretty pleased with the way this one finished up. I decided to come back along this shoreline here to the left and break up that side a little bit, bringing in some more rocks along the edges, and then ultimately the last touch was taking some of the watercolor to separate out some of those rocks where the water would come in there, just to break up the monotony of this left-hand shoreline a little bit. Once I did that, I was pretty happy with the end result here, and I've got a painting that really does bring me back to the memory of this particular day of being out here in the snow on this river, which is ultimately all I was after to begin with. So very happy with the end result on this one. This is Snowy Davidson River painting. Hope you guys enjoyed this one. Until next time, happy painting, everybody.